Standing at the intersection of modern urban life and centuries of accumulated history, Boston, Massachusetts holds within its colonial foundations and weathered walls a darkness that refuses to be forgotten. In the 1970s, Ed and Lorraine Warren traveled to one of America's oldest cities to confront an entity whose presence predated the very building it inhabited, an intelligence that had waited beneath the floorboards through generations of human occupancy, watching and measuring those who walked above. This is the story of the Boston Haunting, a case that would challenge everything the Warrens understood about the depth and persistence of paranormal infestation. Boston's historical density sets it apart from younger American cities. Here, colonial structures stand beside Victorian townhouses, each layer of construction built upon foundations that reach back to the earliest days of European settlement. The streets themselves trace pathways worn by centuries of footsteps, and beneath the modern surface lies a landscape shaped by colonial tensions, industrial upheaval, and waves of immigrant struggle. Ed and Lorraine Warren understood that such concentrated history created ideal conditions for paranormal phenomena. Residual hauntings thrived in places where human emotion had saturated the very stones and soil. More troubling still, adversarial entities could anchor themselves to locations where suffering had been most intense, drawing energy from the accumulated pain embedded in a site across generations. The family who contacted the Warrens had moved into their home less than a year before the phenomena began. Their residence occupied one of Boston's older neighborhoods, in a building that incorporated structural elements dating to the colonial period. What appeared on the surface to be a relatively ordinary Boston townhouse, concealed within its ground floor walls and foundations that predated the rest of the structure by more than a century. The family had been excited about their new home initially, drawn to its historic character and the sense of connection to Boston's past. That excitement transformed into mounting dread as they came to understand that their home's connection to history was far more active and far more dangerous than they had imagined. The phenomena began subtly. Objects left on the kitchen table overnight would be found rearranged in the morning, moved with deliberate care rather than scattered violently. A door on the ground floor, secured each evening with a modern latch, would be found standing open at dawn. The family might have dismissed these incidents as forgetfulness or mechanical failure, if not for the quality of presence they felt throughout the ground floor. It was a watchfulness, an assessment, as though something stood just beyond the edge of visible space, studying them with patient intelligence. The presence was strongest in the oldest parts of the building, concentrated in areas where colonial-era masonry showed through gaps in later construction. Then came the marks on the walls. Twice within a 3-week period, the family woke to find patterns pressed or traced into the plaster of their ground floor walls. The marks appeared to be deliberate rather than random, though their meaning remained opaque. Most unsettling was their impermanence. Within days of appearing, the marks faded and disappeared without any treatment or intervention from the family. It was as though whatever had created them withdrew its energy, allowing the physical world to reassert its normal state. The auditory phenomena proved most consistent and most disturbing. In the pre-dawn hours, between 4 and 5 in the morning, a sound would begin beneath the ground floor floorboards. Witnesses described it with remarkable consistency as footsteps, the measured tread of an adult moving with deliberate purpose through the subfloor space. The sound followed a fixed path each morning, traversing from one end of the ground floor to the other before ceasing abruptly. The family tried everything to account for the sound through natural means. They checked for animals, examined the foundation for structural issues, even consulted with contractors about settling and thermal expansion. Nothing explained the rhythmic, purposeful quality of what they heard, or the precision with which it followed the same path each morning before stopping at the same approximate time. A local priest visited the home at the family's request. He witnessed the phenomena himself, hearing the footsteps during an overnight vigil and feeling the oppressive presence that saturated the ground floor. Unable to provide relief through simple prayer and blessing, he reached out to Ed and Lorraine Warren, whose reputation for handling serious paranormal cases had spread throughout New England's religious communities. The Warrens agreed immediately to investigate. Ed and Lorraine arrived with the New England Society for Psychic Research documentation team, prepared for an extended investigation. Lorraine's initial walkthrough produced powerful impressions concentrated on the ground floor, particularly in the area above the subfloor space from which the footsteps originated. What she perceived there disturbed her deeply. The presence was ancient, not in the sense of being old, but in the sense of being long established. This was not a recent intrusion, but something that had occupied the space before the current structure existed above it. The entity's connection to the physical location ran deeper than the building itself, extending into the soil and original foundations below. This was a presence that had been there when the first colonial structure was raised on that spot, and it had remained through every subsequent generation. Ed Warren's physical examination supported Lorraine's impressions. He carefully documented the areas where original colonial masonry was exposed within later construction, recognizing these contact points as potential anchors for the paranormal presence. His historical research into the property revealed that the land had been occupied since the earliest days of Boston's settlement, with structures rising and falling on the same footprint across centuries. What suffering had occurred there, what violence or tragedy had first drawn the entity to this spot, was lost to incomplete historical records. But the entity itself remained, deeply rooted in a place it clearly considered its own domain. The Warrens' assessment was unambiguous. This was a serious infestation requiring formal intervention. The depth and age of the entity's connection to the location meant that simple blessing would be insufficient. A presence that had occupied a site through multiple generations of human habitation was correspondingly more difficult to dislodge and more capable of resisting lighter forms of spiritual intervention. Additionally, the family's experience of being watched and assessed indicated that the infestation was in its intermediate phase. The entity was gathering information about its current occupants, learning their vulnerabilities and patterns. Ed Warren had seen this evaluative phase before, and he knew it typically preceded more aggressive, targeted phenomena. The window for effective intervention was closing. Working with the Boston Archdiocese, Ed Warren arranged for a senior priest experienced in residential exorcism to conduct the intervention. The ceremony required 2 separate sessions. The first and most demanding session addressed the ground floor and subfloor space directly, the epicenter of the paranormal activity. The second session, conducted days later, provided comprehensive blessing of the entire property to prevent any residual presence from re-establishing itself in other areas of the home. The subfloor session presented extraordinary challenges. The space beneath the ground floor boards was cramped and difficult to access, requiring the priest and Ed Warren to physically enter through a narrow opening. Lorraine remained on the ground floor above them, monitoring the entity's responses psychically and communicating her impressions to a NESBR team member who relayed information to the men below. As the prayers and blessings began, both the priest and Ed Warren felt immediate resistance. The temperature in the confined subfloor space dropped dramatically, their breath misting in air that moments before had been seasonably warm. A sensation of physical pressure built around them, as though the space itself was contracting, pressing in from all sides. The resistance intensified as the prayers continued. Ed Warren later described it as one of the most demanding spiritual confrontations of his career. The entity that had occupied this space for generations was not surrendering easily. It pushed back with the full force of its long establishment, drawing on centuries of accumulated presence. Lorraine, monitoring from above, reported waves of malevolent energy radiating from the subfloor space, surging and retreating as the prayers progressed. The culminating moment came nearly 2 hours into the session, when both men felt the pressure suddenly release and the temperature begin to normalize. The entity's resistance had broken. That night, for the first time in months, the house remained silent in the pre-dawn hours. No measured footsteps sounded beneath the floorboards. No presence watched from the shadows of the ground floor. The family slept undisturbed, and when they woke, the oppressive atmosphere that had characterized their home since shortly after moving in had lifted. The second blessing session several days later proceeded without incident, sealing the intervention's success. The Boston haunting entered the NESBR case files as one of the most significant urban investigations of the 1970s. Ed Warren referenced it frequently in his university lectures as an example of how older American cities, with their colonial foundations and centuries of layered history, represented paranormal landscapes of particular complexity. The case reinforced a principle that guided much of the Warrens' later work, that the age of a location's human occupation directly correlated with the potential depth of its paranormal activity. Investigators working in cities like Boston needed to think not in terms of recent history alone, but in terms of the full span of human presence on a site, reaching back to the earliest structures and the earliest suffering that had occurred in and upon the soil they examined. The family recovered completely following the intervention, reclaiming their home from the presence that had claimed it first. The specific, measured quality of the pre-dawn footsteps that had defined the haunting's most consistent manifestation was never experienced again. But the case left an indelible impression on all who investigated it, a reminder that beneath the surfaces of our oldest cities, in the foundations and soil that predate our modern structures, there are presences that remember what we have forgotten and claim territory we believe belongs only to us. Hashtags Paranormal Stories, True Stories, Haunted Ed and Lorraine Warren, Ghost Stories, Supernatural Scary, Horror Documentary, Boston Haunted House, Colonial History, Paranormal Investigation, Vanishing Roads, Scar Stories, True Crime. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented paranormal case files. All events reference real investigations by Ed and Lorraine Warren.